Okay, I think we might get started. Welcome to the 101 of you who have already joined us. Thank you very, very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah. I am in the policy and advocacy team, or the social justice team for Vinnie's New South Wales. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. But before we move forward, I would now like to introduce Yvonne Weldon, Chairperson of the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council, to do a welcome to country. Thank you so much, Yvonne.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. My name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Caritas here in New South Wales. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very, very much, Yvonne, for that beautiful and warm welcome to country. Yvonne, we've had the privilege of having Yvonne for a number of our Rosalie Rendu events over the years, and it's always been very powerful and very meaningful, and we appreciate it so very much. So thank you so much for taking the time, Yvonne. Thank you. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Geraldine Doogue, who is going to be the facilitator for tonight's Rosalie Rendu event. Geraldine is a renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster who is much respected for her work reporting on news and current affairs. Geraldine completed a Bachelor of Arts and planned to train as a school teacher in Perth, but in 1972 applied on impulse for a cadetship in journalism instead. And I'm sure many, many people are grateful that you did so, Geraldine. She has carved out an enviable reputation across print, television and radio, including the Australian, ABC's Nationwide, 2UE, Channel 10, ABC TV's Compass program, and continues on in various roles on ABC Radio National. Geraldine played a central role in ABC TV's coverage of the First Gulf War in 1991 and received 2 Penguin Awards and a United Nations Media Peace Prize for her efforts. In 2000, Geraldine was awarded a Churchill Fellowship for Social and Cultural Reporting, and in 2003 was made an Officer in the Order of Australia for distinguished service to the community and to the media on issues involving ethics, values, religion, and social change. In 2018, she was admitted to the Australian Media Hall of Fame. So Geraldine, a very, very big thank you for taking the time to be the facilitator for tonight's event. And I'm very excited. I'm sure we all are very excited to have you with us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And look, it's lovely to be here with everybody. Even I wish we could see each other. And of course, when I hear that sort of, list, I think of Western Australia, which is where I began. And I was speaking tonight with people here. Of course, I can't go back there. I'm exiled from my own state. But anyway, maybe that'll change in the times to come. And I'd like to thank Yvonne Weldon as well, and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. My particular land that I dwell in when I'm at home is Camaragal land, given that we've all been asked to nominate where we're from. So, it's a beautiful part of the world to live. Now, I'd particularly like to welcome today our special guests and our distinguished panellists, Nicki Hutley from Deloitte Access Economics, Jody Broun, the CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Office and Group Deputy Secretary of Aboriginal Strategy and Outcomes, and Kirsty Robertson, who is the CEO of Caritas Australia. I'd like to welcome all the representatives of the St Vincent de Paul Society, particularly the State Council, and board members and society members and volunteers and staff. There's quite a brew here tonight for this special occasion. I know it's a special occasion in your year. And welcome all new colleagues and supporters. Let's hope they grow every year. It's a venerable institution indeed. Now, I'd like to introduce Brooke Simmons to kick us off with to lead us in a short spiritual reflection. Brooke is Vice President of Social Justice and Chair of the Social Justice Committee. So, Brooke, over to you.
Thank you, Geraldine. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Camaragal people, whose land I am dialing in from. So it is my pleasure to introduce the remarkable woman from whom this forum takes its name, and her part in the founding story of the St Vincent de Paul Society. Born in 1786 in the mountains of France, Jean-Marie Rendu was the oldest of 4 girls and was just 3 years old when the French Revolution broke out. As many faithful priests fled persecution, the Rendu family home became a refuge for many on the road. In 1796, her father and youngest sister passed away, and Jean-Marie stepped up to look after her mother and other siblings. The young Jean-Marie was inspired by the Daughters of Charity and joined them at age 16. She was given the name Sister Rosalie and sent to Paris, where she came to call the slums of the Mouffetard district home for the next 54 years. She showed great courage and dedication, dedicating herself to as many people as she could help as possible. She opened a free clinic, a pharmacy, a school, an orphanage, a childcare centre, a home for the elderly, and founded a youth club for young workers. She's fondly known as the good mother of all and was renowned for her infinite kindness. In the bloody uprisings of 1830 and 1848, Sister Rosalie would climb through the barricades, assisting the injured from both sides. She also worked tirelessly through numerous epidemics to alleviate the suffering of the sick, with little regard for her own health and safety. In the midst of all this activity, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul was founded in 1833 by Frederick Ozanam and his friends. Emmanuel Bailly, their first president, enlisted Sister Rosalie to mentor the group. She provided spiritual and practical guidance and introduced them to families in need. Her influence remains in all the Society's works today, as we continue to aspire to her vision of service. As she said, "Be kind and love, for love is your first gift to the poor. They will appreciate your kindness and your love more than anything else you bring to them." The uprisings and epidemics of the early 19th century changed Paris and Europe forever. Likewise, the COVID-19 pandemic and the natural disasters at the start of this year have led to widespread suffering and some drastic changes in how we go about our lives, and will continue to cause changes and disruption for many months. Although centuries apart, these crises have exacerbated poverty and disadvantage, testing the strength of our communities. As we look to the future and create a vision for our world, may we be inspired by Rosalie Rendu's energy and dedication to work towards a fairer future for all, and to hear her words as she asks us across the years, what are you doing for humanity, for the poor? Thank you. Back to you, Geraldine.
Thank you very much indeed, Brooke. Yes, look, that's a wonderful overview. And, you know, just a reminder that when you study history, you realise, you forget the fact that people had to live through all of these different stages. You know, you learn that it got to 1848 and there was sort of finally changes, but actually they had to live through all of this and survive. I always find it quite overpowering when I hear stories like that. So thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to introduce our panellists, Nicki Hutley. And Nicki, I've spoken to Nicki over many years, and I'm delighted that she's agreed to be part of tonight. She's a highly experienced economist with a very broad-based experience in economic policy. She has a really good corporate memory, is how I'd put it, honed due to watching and listening and being very rational in her 3 decades of practice. You can regularly see her on the drum and the project, and she's worked for all levels of government and the private sector and not-for-profits. And she's a passionate woman under there. Somehow that's got through all the economics. That's a naughty thing for me to say, but anyway, she can take me to task. But she's got a passionate believer in improving the quality of lives. So I want to welcome Nicki. Jody Brown's a Yindjibarndi woman whose family connections are from the Pilbara in WA, which is a place very close to my heart. Jody was appointed Chief Executive of the Aboriginal Housing Office, the AHO, 2 years ago, and she's following some restructures. She is also leading work across the cluster on Aboriginal strategy and outcomes, and she's held a lot of positions in government and co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First People. And I might add, she worked for Red Cross before she was director of New South Wales and ACT for Australian Red Cross for 4.5 years. And Kirsty Robertson is a very accomplished leader, again, across a range of Catholic ministries and not-for-profit organisations. She's the chief executive now of Caritas Australia. She was for 5 years the Chief Executive Officer of the Mary MacKillop Foundation, and she has been interested in change management and in a way how I suppose you can use the structures that we have to really broker more equality in the various areas that she's devoted herself to: international development, First Nations, community development, no interest and low interest loans to rural and remote Australians. So look, it's fantastic to have you all with us. And I just want, before we start, because one of the things that we said was, well, look, you know, how are we going to, what's the essential question that we're going to pose ourselves? And really it is whether this disruption caused by the pandemic will usher in a different sort of society. Is this a moment to use the crisis to create more just and compassionate communities? And that's what I'm going to ask each of our guests to talk for about 3 to 4 minutes, and I'll be vaguely savage at interrupting you if you go over. And then we'll do a bit more of Q&A, then I'll go to some of your questions. I just know, just totally fortuitously, I opened my tablet magazine yesterday. There was a whole lot of them came all at once. I don't know where they were. But it was a terrific, it's 180 years since the tablet has been going, the oldest religious journal in the world, I read. And it's just the fact their editorial was just incredibly appropriate. This has to be a time of metanoia, of moral and spiritual renewal, they wrote. There can be no return to the world as it was before the appearance of the virulent coronavirus. There are profound lessons to be learned, some of them still only half understood. And the argument was that the Catholic Church, for all its woes and all the baggage it's carrying at the moment, is still, they are suggesting, the largest membership of any single organisation on the planet. And it still retains greater moral power than any single government. Its promise, in the stirring words of Gaudium and Spes from the Second Vatican Council's final decree, I mean, these glorious words, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. This may be imperfectly realised, but it remains the Church's lodestar. So I just thought that was a fantastic backdrop, really, for us to start with. So I'm going to ask first, how do you think the disruption caused by the pandemic might reshape society? What opportunities are on offer to create a more just and compassionate community? Nicki, first to you, how would you answer that?
Sorry, a bit of dexterity issues there,
sure.
Geraldine. So to me, this offers, you know, if we think just first from an economics perspective, and I will answer your previous sort of remark in saying that to me it is so important that we bring the social and the environment together with the economic. It's never one or the other. But economics is a powerful way sometimes of delivering a message to say, for example, the work that we've done around why the rate of New Start should be raised is because it's not just a moral imperative. There's really good economic logic behind doing it. And that seems to be something that resonates today. It should be enough just to do the right thing, but we do have scarce resources. And I guess, you know, we do need to prove a point. But back to the central question, you know, we are doing something that hasn't been seen in more than a generation, in a century. The world has been upended. And we have been given permission, you know, governments have thrown away the language of debt and deficit crises and emergencies. Economists have said it's not a problem now. It's not something you can keep building forever, but interest rates are low. We can throw out the textbook and we can just change the narrative completely. And so what I would have liked to have seen perhaps last week in the budget was that textbook thrown out and said, if we're going to spend all of this money, if we can cope with debt, that debt still has to be for a purpose. It has to give us bang for buck. It has to address the big issues of our time. And those big issues are around inequality. They are around climate change. They are around lack of housing affordability and growing homelessness. there are so many problems that we still need to solve. And so using the backdrop of this crisis as this clean slate is a perfect opportunity. And I love the IMF talks about growing back greener, smarter and fairer. What more could you ask for? And particularly, you know, we need to deal with poverty, we need to deal with inequality, and we need to ask the right questions. Not how much does this cost, but what does the cost of failing to act on these issues?
Thank you very much. Greener, smarter, fairer. I hadn't heard that. That's interesting. Okay, we'll take that. Further. Now, I'd like to ask Jody. How would you answer that question, Jody?
Just a moment. I have to take myself off mute. Hello, everyone. Look, I suppose firstly, I do want to thank Yvonne for what she always does is a very deep and meaningful welcome and acknowledgement of country. I'm sitting on Bidjigal country at the moment, but I am in Jabundi from the Pilbara in WA. And like Geraldine, stuck over here and can't go and visit my family. So much sympathy to you, Geraldine, because it is very difficult not to, to know that you're locked out of your own state. But I suppose that does bring home to us what I do always, like to remember is that there's a lot of other people in worse situations than I am. And lots of people who are separated from their families for much longer. And I suppose what I'd hope that the disruption does with the pandemic is actually for people to be much more empathetic about other people's circumstances and, whether they're people who are refugees and fleeing violence and in their countries, having some real sympathy around that. Because that separation from families we're feeling so deeply as people, and I think to me it is a little bit around acknowledging humanity and what binds us in humanity, and having that as something that we've all been reminded of. And the other thing I would just make, the other point I would make, and so that's the humanity point. But then on the other side of that, working within government, but I know all of us have been in the same boat, is that we've been asked to spring to action, if you like, in terms of being able to respond in a whole range of different ways that we haven't before. And the mobilisation, the speed and agility in which we did that, I think was just amazing in terms of responding to people's needs and looking at those most vulnerable people and how can we respond to that need. Using technology, obviously, and I think back to other pandemics and not having that technology, but we've been able to just respond really quickly. And so people, even though they've been working from home, have just gone, like I know my staff are working incredibly hard and we're delivering huge amounts of resource and support to communities. There was an immediate response to our most vulnerable communities, both in homelessness, but also for Aboriginal communities in far western New South Wales, working with them. What would be an action plan to protect you if the virus got into your communities? And just the thought and the overall organisation that went into that, I think just proves that we can actually respond really quickly, and perhaps we need to bring some more of that sort of attitude to how we respond to issues in the future. Things like the homelessness, I think particularly always regarded a very difficult to resolve, but there was an immediate response, some additional dollars thrown at it, and actually, people looked after. And I think that's what I'd like to hope we can do in the future as well.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to pick you up on when we get to our discussion. That's very interesting what you say. And Kirsty, how would you answer it?
Thanks, Geraldine. Yeah, it was interesting. I was, first of all, I joined you from Gadigal land on what is a beautiful evening, a stunning evening here in Sydney. I was listening to Yvonne's beautiful welcome to country before, when she spoke of the importance of lived experiences. And I think for me, that's something that's so important because, the pandemic isn't happening in isolation. And so for me, we were already hearing this growing discontent with how our leaders were responding to the challenges of climate change, these rising numbers of small-scale natural disasters in Australia, we had the bushfires, you know, almost unimaginable in their scale and ferocity. And we also had things like the Black Lives Matters campaigns and this sort of growing racial unrest across the world. So I think that sort of context, the lived experience that everyone's coming into this pandemic with, is really important, because this is, for me anyway, about the fact that, you know, all of those crises always affect the poor, the marginalised, the vulnerable disproportionately, all of them. And so, as I think Nicki was saying before, you know, this is a genuinely pivotal global moment, you know, and these are rare. You know, we've seen individuals and families, you know, having their normal life upended in what was probably completely unimaginable ways, you know, and I know that's true of me and of most people in my circle. But the real question, I think, is, you know, how will the pandemic influence the future behaviour, right, of individuals, the future behaviour of organisations and nation states? And so to get back to your question, which was about the opportunities, I think there's a couple. The first is the urgency. You know, I've been working in this poverty space for a while, and we sort of, I'm sure the others know, you grind away, you feel like you get some small wins, but the pandemic has created this sense of urgency, and in that there's a real opportunity, you know. The Gates Foundation have predicted by 2060 climate change could be just as deadly as COVID-19, but that doesn't get the same sort of traction. We've got, you know, the World Bank saying that poverty is going to increase for the first time in 2 decades, but again, not much traction there. So the pandemic creates this sense of urgency, and secondly, I think it it has this renewed commitment to solidarity in all of our communities, and that's much more than sporadic acts of generosity. It's like thinking and acting in terms of community, really for the first time on a local, national and international level, which I think is really exciting. But thirdly, I think it's the innovation. I can't remember, somebody else was just talking about that as well. You know, I think we used to have to incentivise innovation in organisations. I literally had an innovation fund trying to encourage people to think differently. And now we're being forced to do this in our lives and in our work. So I think that's really exciting. I think this is the, you know, an incubator for imagining a more just and more compassionate world. So, you know, for me, now's the time for imagining and reimagining what the world can look like. And what the world might look like if, I think Brooke before was talking about a quote that said, if love is your first gift to the poor. I thought was beautiful. Imagine the world, what the world would look like if we all, as individuals and as organisations and nation states, had that at our core.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I'm quite struck by the amount of energy that you're all displaying. You know, it's certainly not a chorus of doom, is it? And that's coming across in lots of the reports. It's a strange time, and I'm going to go back to Nicki Hutley because I think we're getting sort of mixed messages. So we're getting messages from, say, the Reserve Bank saying, we are really worried about next year. And so you're inclined to listen. But then a lot of the material coming out is suggesting the reverse. I'm not just talking about extraordinary stock exchange behaviour, by the way. I'm just talking about the energy, the sense of the smiles I'm seeing. You know, I see a lot coming through from listeners at Radio National. Quite interesting. There's not a lot, I don't understand it. There's not a lot of doom and gloom. Actually, there's worry about others, but not about themselves. So what do you think's going on, Nicki?
So you've heard the terms before about a patchwork economy or a two-speed economy, and that tended to relate to things to do with the previous mining boom. And I think we're going through a bit of a patchwork recession. Somebody pointed out to me today, and it wasn't kind what they were saying, but they were saying, well, you know, even if you think the effective unemployment rate is 12%, that means 88% of people still have their jobs. And they were thinking about that as a good thing, as of course everybody who still has a job, it is a good thing. And there are people who are in WA, the lucky ducks, who are, you know, when I've had meetings, Zoom meetings with my colleagues over there, they're sitting around the office, they're sitting side by side, they're going to the pub, and life is pretty normal, even more normal than New South Wales. We're kind of doing things a lot more normally, at least compared to Victoria. So for some people, you know, even in some industries, what we've seen is that things have, because people can't travel, for example, they're doing heaps more things to their home. Even people who are on job seeker, the change in their life from having the coronavirus supplement. You know, we hear lots of organisations like Vinny saying, actually, we've had fewer people. There've been fewer mental health issues. So for all the increase that Black Dog has seen in the number of people reporting anxiety, there've also been different cohorts who have in fact been helped by some of the actions that have come through. We've seen, as you talk about the innovation, we've seen some companies be able to I hate the word, but it's very, you know, consultant word, but they have pivoted. They have been agile. They have, you know, and you hear the ubiquitous example of gin producers who suddenly manufacture hand sanitizer, or clothing manufacturers making masks. But it's true. We are being more creative and more inventive.
So what do you,
of course,
go on.
But it doesn't apply to everyone, and it depends. And you said everybody knows somebody who's lost a job. Right at the start, our son-in-law is in hospitality. He lost his job very quickly. Could see the writing on the wall. Now, he's one of the lucky ones that's bounced back and found a fantastic job. But there are so many people out there. And I tell you what, for a while, he was doing some pretty low-paid menial work because he was going to do whatever it took him. But he was one of the lucky ones. You know, we keep hearing these stories about 500 people applying for one job to stack shelves at Woolies. You know, there are a lot of people out there who are still doing it very tough. But if you're one of the lucky ones.
The reason why I think this is important for Vinnie's is that I think this is going to be more complex and a more messy story than we imagined. In other words, I would have thought, you know, when I first agreed to partake, I would have thought that it would be obvious who the casualties were. We'd see them. And it would actually be easy for Vinnie's. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think it's, you know, that's what I'm trying to get at. That there's a sense of energy around, which sort of typically is associated with optimism. So somehow, you know, when do you think, and I think this could be very important for Vinnie's, you know, when do you think it's going to become sort of obvious that we are dealing with a genuine patchwork experience?
Well, I mean, it should be obvious now. And I think the problem is this is a recession like no other we've ever had. You know, it's not interest rates went up, the economy, or we had a financial crisis and right across the economy, things came to a halt. Here we've got some industries absolutely devastated, other industries actually doing okay, some industries, very few, but a couple of industries doing quite well. Same with individuals. It's right across, but there are far more people doing it tough. I mean, unemployment has more than doubled in effective terms. We've had people leave the workforce. You know, the economy was slow before this started. We had people in a lot of trouble.
I know, so we did.
There's right. You know, whilst there's optimism, I think there's some of us going, we can take this crisis and we can turn it into something better. We've seen the government, you know, Jody's right, the government acted so fast. It put things in place to help people. The trouble is all of that is about to come to an end well before the economy has got itself into any sort of condition. We're still well over 400,000 jobs short of where we were before COVID. So there are massive problems, and optimism doesn't mean that there aren't problems. It's that we think not only can we deal with the crisis, but we can actually leverage this crisis to, you know, as
do something
before, to make it even creative, to do more, to have a vision about a better society. But it will take a lot of guts.
Okay, I'll go back to Jody, and because Jody, it really did strike me what you said, that the speed of springing into action, and I mean, I remember hearing Pat Turner talk about this, you know, from the peaks, the pride in the way that was organised, so that the Indigenous communities around the place just behaved like they took their lives into their own hands, and it was just magnificent. It was actually magnificent, tremendous degree of pride. But do you see what I'm worried about? I mean, do you think so? Wouldn't want to, like, that's something to appreciate, isn't it? But can you see it? Do you think it's changed? the communities you know, or how would you see the next step?
So yeah, probably been quite empowering for a lot of communities.
Yeah, that's the impression I get too.
Yeah, the engagement with them, and that they have been able to take that level of control. The stimulus supplements have been very beneficial. I think if there's some lessons out of this, is that how much difference that does make to people's lives. I think there's some lessons for broader society to say, well, hang on a minute, unemployment rates in Aboriginal communities are a lot more than what you're experiencing now, and it's been on the back burner and not a lot done about it. So maybe it reminds people that there's more work to be done around making sure Aboriginal people have equal access to employment opportunities. We in Aboriginal housing have been really quite I don't know, really lucky in that it's focused some attention on we need to stimulate the economy, particularly in regional areas. And so we had in 12 weeks to spend $13.5 million in regional New South Wales, largely in regional New South Wales, on a lot of our properties. And it was about getting jobs, and out of about 350 people, about 100 of those were Aboriginal people. And we delivered the whole $13.5 million right across the board, solar on our houses, a whole range of other things for community that they're engaged with, and there's employment. And small businesses saved from going down the tubes in places like Tamworth because they got quite a large contract to deliver something for us. So there's been some real opportunities in there. What I hope is that we can maintain that sort of level as well. We did get some additional money for this financial year as well. So it has meant that, you know, there's been a focus on keeping people in jobs and keeping people in regional jobs. And to me, that's really important and critical to the communities that I work with. But I think it's been a good reminder to say, you know, there is lots and lots of people who one are worse off than people who might be losing their jobs temporarily now, but who have very little opportunity in the way of employment in a normal environment, and all of a sudden there's some.
Well, that's right.
So I think we've got to remind people that there's people who are experiencing the sorts of things people experience, and that's what I was saying about perhaps society can be more empathetic, more sympathetic around people who don't always have equal access to employment or education or other services in this environment.
Well, that's what I've been wondering about listening to you, and I'll go to Kirsty next, whether it's almost like, you know, the deserving and undeserving poor, which has sort of bedeviled so much of this arena. And the pandemic changes a lot of that. Changes the nature of the discussion. I mean, do you agree, Kirsty? Do you see, you did say, you know, the urgency, communitarian approach that you'd noticed, and innovation. So are you seeing an opportunity that of sort of almost being hopeful about this rather than despairing?
A few things there, I think, Geraldine. The first one is, I think, you know, history tells us during crises in general, you know, Australians become more altruistic, they give more, they want to volunteer their time more. You know, and so we're definitely seeing that, and we see that, you know, anecdotally, and we see that in figures coming out of a number of charities right now. And so, you know, I think there's that sign of people who aren't affected wanting to be actively part of a solution that is definitely feeding into that sense of optimism and that sense of the common good, perhaps. But I would pause before saying that the optimism goes too much wider than that, because I think it's a question of voice. I think it's a question of who we're listening to, and whose stories are making it into our media and making it into the ears of policymakers. I think, you know, and this is the responsibility of agencies, you know, like Vinnie's and others, is to, you know, amplify the voice of those who are being left behind right now, to, you know, speak truth to that power and to tell those stories. So for me, there's a little bit of a concern about making sure that the truth of the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalised right now is being told in a way that rings true to them.
Okay, no, good. Now, look, I've got a question here from Jack de Groot, the Vinnie CEO. 2020, he suggests, has been about resilience. I agree with him. It's been about surviving and getting health right and being safe. But building for the future is going to need some innovative approaches. Vinnie's always been up for making a greater contribution to achieving a hand up for people in our local communities. What 3 big ideas do you all suggest could the St Vincent de Paul Society pursue to build a more equitable and inclusive Australia in the next 2 years? So we'll just nail you all to specifics now. Get away from the rhetoric.
I think Jack's trying to get us to do his job for him.
Nicki, have you distilled this sort of thinking?
Oh, look, I have, people are always asking me, if you were Prime Minister, you know, what would you do? And there's a very long laundry list. And I would just say up front that, you know, there are people far smarter than me who have put their minds to this issue, not just this year, but for many years. We have had people talking about what should be done. But from a Vinnie's perspective, as opposed to a government perspective, well, I'd like to see Vinnie's advocate, because one of the things I would really like to say, and one of the things that has just been snowballing quite a bit since the budget, is the idea of you know, increasing female participation. We know this was a peak recession, and it's been looking a bit like a blue recovery. And it's not just women who've been affected, of course. It's the young, it's refugees. Even before this, migrant women had double the unemployment rate of Australian-born women. You know, and this entrenches disadvantage, as Kirsty was saying. So if you're going to advocate for something, you know, supporting women to participate in the workforce, and that's of course about extending the access to good quality childcare for more people. But it's also a cultural change too, and that needs to be embedded right from the start. And society as a whole, whatever campaigns we can run to say that women matter, that women can do anything that men can do, or almost anything. Sometimes we can do it better. You know, to right from the word go, kids, the girls who at 6 years of old should not suddenly think that they're not good at maths. So I'd like to see something around gender, raising the voice. You know, I mean, you're all talking about disadvantage. I think the treatment of refugees, particularly those who've got left behind in this recession, those who, you know, 100,000 or so on temporary migrant visas who were just being left for nothing. You know, helping those. But then I think it all stems from the best thing we can possibly do to get, or to diminish inequality, to diminish poverty, is to start right at the very beginning. And so anything that is done around supporting families in need, supporting education, dealing with, you know, families that have some level of dysfunction, the more we can support our children right from the word go, we know that not just from a social, but from an economic perspective, that will deliver the best bang for your buck. So let's focus your efforts on the young ones. But, you know, as I said, it's a long list of people who need help.
Yes, it is. Jody, have you distilled your thoughts on this?
Look, I suppose a couple of my passions are around justice reform. I'm involved with the Just Reinvest group, as well as a patron for another justice group, around not sending people into incarceration because basically they're poor and they've, you know, have had bad lives, or they've got mental health issues or whatever. And we tend to rely very heavily on a very punitive justice system that doesn't support people to actually come out of poverty or to have successful lives, if you like. And women are also completely in that category as well. So women who are incarcerated in the justice system as well. And I've been involved with that for a long time, including when I was with Red Cross. And I just think we have to do things completely different in the justice system. And I think it did highlight people who are incarcerated as a very vulnerable group through this process as well. And we have to be saying, why are they in there, if we can actually make some changes quite swiftly to their, to where they are in the system. The other part of it, I think that it has highlighted for me, and it came up in our planning with Aboriginal communities, is, and look, Aboriginal groups have been saying this for years and years about the justice system, you know. It's not anything new. And then on top of that, things like it highlighted the huge gap in access to technology, to the, you know, if people need to be able
digital
to
divide.
And in other parts of Australia, that's really not performing. But also food security, and there's parts of New South Wales where, you know, the grocery basket's 300% more than it is at the local town, you know, from somewhere 200 kilometres away. So those issues around food security, you know, the health services, all of those, it just highlights where we haven't been investing and where we haven't dealt with some of those intractable issues that Aboriginal communities and peak bodies have been raising for years and years and years. And so to me, it does put a microscope on some of that as well.
Okay, thank you. These are all very big, big aims. I hope Jack's getting something, you know, that can take away. How are you thinking about it, Kirsty?
I look forward to talking to him in 2 years' time and seeing how he's gone with all of this. Yeah, interesting one. I think I'm interested more in the less about the what and more about the how. I think for me, Vinnie's could play a really good role in assisting marginalised and vulnerable groups participate more directly in policy making. I think it would contribute to designing more effective policies against poverty and social exclusion. And I think it's an important shift away from excluding further the excluded. You know, there's some major challenges in doing that, the biggest of which, of course, is that marginalised people aren't a homogenous group. But I do think that Vinnie's could play a really interesting and important role there. And we've certainly seen examples of that across Europe now, where policies have been designed with excluded groups in part of the process. So I think Vinnie's could really... As
part of pandemic?
No, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, right.
So, you know, help enabling them to participate in the process. And I think Vinnie's is really well placed to be involved in that sort of space.
Yes. Go on.
Sorry? No, I mean, I think for me, the second one is somehow leveraging, and I think you said this earlier on, Geraldine, you know, the Catholic community, and in particular the Catholic social justice community, is a significant player in this space. And I can't help but wonder what would happen if we all sort of, you know, got together and tried to solve a single problem, or at least, you know, worked more closely in coalition and in partnerships together. I think there's a real opportunity there for some of the, you know, big organisations like Vinnie's to dream big in that space about joint partnerships and joint work. And finally, I have to say this, but at the end of the day, cry of the earth, cry of the poor, you know, our common home, and, you know, the message of Laudato Si, the fact that we can't just focus on people at the end of the day. You know, the planet that we're living on is what sustains us. And I think Vinnie's has a voice there as well.
Yes, I must say, I think that's very rich, what you're just suggesting. I think that the whole dignity, that word dignity, you know, dignity of labour, dignity of work that came through with, you know, the old social justice message, I think it could be really refreshed for the present day now. You know, I feel that there's quite, people have been buffeted around and thrown up in the air, and there's a lot of preparedness to rethink some of these nostrums, which I think is terribly interesting. And I want to come back to Nicki Hutley about the role of debt too. But we've got some questions that have come through. One question, should Australia consider introducing a universal basic income that provides people with an allowance above the poverty line at a bare minimum? Alternatively, should Australia consider universal basic services, which would guarantee people access to housing, for instance? Now, Nicki, you know, you're a good observer of the political climate, and do you think, I'm not saying there's a reception for that right now, but could you imagine that moving as an idea and gaining a bit more traction than usual?
So I'm actually doing work, I'm part of a think tank called Singularity U, which is a global organisation, and we are actually doing some work on universal basic income, because it is a difficult one, and it certainly does not receive any traction in Australia at the moment. And I think the universality of it is what stops it in its tracks at the moment, and perhaps thinking of a wider safety net might be a safer way in Australia, but certainly in other countries, even in some states within the US, there is a much louder voice at the moment to look at how a UBI might work. And of course, there have been trials around the world in all sorts of places, including in cities in the US. The most famous probably is the recent Finnish one, which looked at, there was a small increase, around about 9% in hours worked amongst the participants, but the really big increases were in self-esteem and physical and mental well-being, and some of those things which it's much harder to put a price tag on, but which we economists do find ways to put price tags on. The argument now, though, at the moment, and I'm seeing quite a bit of this in the media, is there's almost a bit of this of an argument and a debate over, should it be UBI or should it be universal basic services? And my answer would be that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think if you were to go completely, look, we should have services accessible to everyone. You know, the fact that mental health services are not is just the stark reality around that, and the impact of the pandemic on particularly on levels of anxiety has laid that bare. And so more money has gone into mental health. But, you know, when you think about, you know, housing, for example.
Well, the housing is the real one, isn't it?
That is a, you know, and I probably should have put that as one of my three, because that is the crisis, I think, for Australia, or at least it was pre-COVID anyway, apart from climate change. So it doesn't necessarily have to be either. And I worry a little bit about the universal basic services, because I think if we have government providing every solution, that isn't always going to be the right outcome. Government absolutely has a role, and certainly in housing it does, because the economics don't stack up. Land in cities costs too much, and we can't do it without government support. But there is this tension between the two. It's debate that is heating up, and you're going to hear lots more about this.
Well, do you think in the world of economics it is it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's what everyone is thinking about. And irrespective of COVID, which of course has catalyzed a whole load of changes in behaviours and thinking, behind the scenes, before this, we were talking about technological change and technological unemployment, and what does AI mean, and what does the world look like? It might not be in 10 years' time, it might be in 20 years' time. You know, we've still got jobs are net growing. But at some point in time, there's likely to be a switch, and we shouldn't be waiting till the 11th hour to be thinking about what that policy looks like. We should be thinking about how we might design it now for a world where, you know, 10% or higher unemployment actually is the norm, where the average job is a 20-hour week because of that technological change. So COVID's prompted a lot of new thinking. And, you know, I think, I wasn't sure if it was Kirsty that mentioned it before, but if we think this is disruption, wait till we start seeing what climate change looks like down the track. This should be the absolute harbinger
warning.
Sounding the warning bells to everybody.
Well, surely the bushfires should have done that.
Well, you would have thought so, but you know, people get into idle. Anyway, I'm diverting away from the UBI versus UBS, but it is a debate that is coming.
Just for my own clarification, pardon me if I've missed some. So, I mean, I thought we did have an assumption of universal basic services by and large. I mean, didn't we? People have, what extra are we talking about here?
So in Australia, we kind of do, but there is a difference in a system. If you look at, let's go to the Scandinavian countries, where basically everything is on for everybody, and it doesn't matter what.
With very big taxes too.
Yeah, well, that's right, but you are not paying your health bill out of, you know, it's a redistribution of wealth. But it also ensures in those countries where there is consistently a high standard. And in Australia, where we have two health systems, we have two education systems. I was actually quite stunned the other day that Australia has 30% of children go to private school. In the UK, I went to high school over there. Gosh, I must have been privileged, because I did go to a private school there, or what as they call a public school. And I just found out that only 7% of children in the UK have a private education.
Is that right? Gee, that
which
is low.
absolutely flabbergasted me.
Yeah.
I would have thought it was far higher. You know, in Canada, 3% do it. Even in the US, it's a really small figure. So we do have universality, but we have a split system and we have split levels. So I'm not saying for a second that the state school system is not good. All three of my kids went through state schools and I thought they were fantastic. But there are levels in different areas of advantage and disadvantage. You find that there is different resourcing. So it's not that we don't have access to a lot of services, it's the quality. And of course, people in the bush don't have the same access to all of those services that those of us that live in cities take for granted.
Right,
and it's not just quality, they're things that they actually can't do, particularly around things like health. You know, you've got to travel a great distance because the populations don't allow for governments to, or governments choose not to spend.
Now, I just want another question here. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Or will I go to my next question? Nobody? No, okay. Now, this is from Dr. Paul Cleary, who's a conference member. On housing, for instance, what are the barriers to providing more training and skills in communities so they can do their own building and maintenance, the latter being very costly for remote communities, for instance, who have to get tradies from far away to do repairs? Given the high cost of building in remote areas, why doesn't Australia make more use of modular housing, again using local labour? So this, Jody, this is, you know, tapping into this question of whether there is a new level of innovation and belief in self, I might add, that might come through.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not sure the pandemic needs to drive that. There is a lot of innovation happening in housing, particularly through the Aboriginal Housing Office, and including using things called modular, which are being provided in a lot of the remote communities, or in remote communities, I shouldn't say a lot, but where we're actually working in partnership with correctional services industry, the Gundy program, to actually build using inmates to build. They gain skills and then employment when they're released as well. But also there's work on the ground in communities. So, I mean, we have very good Aboriginal participation. We have very good Aboriginal building companies that build for us as well. And we're using everything that we do to actually improve Aboriginal people's engagement in construction and participation through employment. So there is a lot of that going on. Again, I think for a lot of remote communities, it comes down to the continuity of those programs, both from a funding sense, but also from the actual, placement on the ground and the continuity of that program. So if you've got one house being built once every 6 years, that's not going to keep people employed. So we've got to actually make sure that it's broader than that, and that we can continue to, have people employed throughout that, throughout anything that's being built in those communities, not just housing. I think we've got to look more broadly than housing. Housing isn't the only answer, but yes, in terms of what I was saying before about employment levels in communities is, I think, something we haven't had a lot of attention on. But I think what I've found with the pandemic and unemployment levels, people will maybe thinking, well, this could happen to me at any point. And maybe there is, people we know can be in those very vulnerable situations very quickly. And it gives people more of a sense of, it's not fault that they're in a vulnerable situation, and we need to do much better to make sure that people have safety nets around them, and that we're building, everything we're doing is designed to help people both prevent them and support them when they are in vulnerable situations, but also whole communities. We've got to work with communities, and the communities have the solutions. We're doing a couple of programs at the moment, which we started, and I'm amazed every day that we're still actually delivering these amazing programs, which are co-designing with communities on a problem they've defined and a solution they will define. Oh. So we went to EOI, please tell us about a housing plus another social issue that you want to resolve in your community, how you might address it, we'll work with you and fund that solution. So it's actually about, it's turning it around. It's not, we don't know the answers. We don't know what the problem is. You tell us what the problem is and you tell us how you want to resolve that problem.
And this was pre-COVID, was it? Or was this to do?
No, it was pre-COVID, but we've been delivering it throughout this year. But I think it's a whole different way of working with community and them leading the solutions rather than government saying we've got all the answers.
Very interesting. And Kirsty, I mean, this is very much what Caritas is thinking about a lot too. And it's a sort of I think it's a very interesting, I don't know, temperamental shift, if I can put it like that. Which I think is quite well, not challenging for Vinnies, but I would have thought it's something that would arrest their thinking, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Jody's point there is the important one. Communities always have their own answer, you know, and so I think for us as organisations, it's our role to accompany communities in determining what the issue is and what the solution is, you know, and that is the path that we are called to be on. I think it's not always something that we get right as organisations. And it's certainly a journey for many of our organisations, and in particular for Catholic organisations that have a long history in this space and a long history of ways of doing things. But, you know, I think that accompaniment model is a model that we've seen in our international work for a very long time, and it works. You know, communities, when they have ownership of solutions, make things happen. You know, and it's just our job to support where necessary.
Yeah, I think this is very exciting, actually. And I just wonder whether there will be more receptivity for that, strangely enough, in the wake of COVID. That's what I think. It's just, you know, I'm just trying to discern it all too. And I just feel it's not quite unfolding as I thought it would. There's something just been released in the community at the moment. This is what I suppose I'm really intrigued by. I mean, for instance, there was a great piece by Father Andy Hamilton in Eureka Street today, talking about the budget in his typical very good way. The success of the budget will depend on whether people respond to its stimulus by buying the goods and services that businesses provide. And that question takes us beyond economic relationships to the whole range of relationships that either encourage trust or suspicion, hope or despair, individual self-interest or attention to others and to the communities as a whole, boldness or timidity. The imagination is of critical importance because it shapes what we see and how the things that we see are related to each other. So it's just so interesting, I think, from a Catholic perspective, to think about how we receive a budget like that, you know, very much a Keynesian budget, Nicki Hutley, you know, with suddenly this Liberal government throwing money at a lot of things at the same time, and sort of saying, well, business will lead the way. I hope they do. And a lot of people, I think, from sort of the community that might be tuned into this webinar saying, well, why didn't we see more of a role for government? Now, you know, we just didn't, did we? Well, we saw a role as a broker of others, but we didn't see that real mixed role that I think a lot of communities, as I said, who might join in this webinar would have liked to see. So how do you make your way through that?
So the first thing I'd say is that this is a quasi-Keynesian budget. So it's kind of a bit of a Keynes in a monetarist, you know, clothing, or the other way around, I guess, because it is putting so much reliance on businesses taking up what's on offer. The money isn't being spent; it's being offered, with the exception, of course, of the tax cuts. So it's like, if you hire somebody, we'll give you something. If you invest, we'll give you something more. And it's predicated on people spending. And you're right, consumer confidence came out today, the latest numbers, and they were up. And people have responded to the tax cuts. But interestingly, the survey that was done, that I actually did with my people, because I gave a budget presentation, there were only 300, small sample, but 30% said they were going to save the entire amount, and 30% said they would save some and spend some. Only a third, or in fact, only 16%
Would go out
said
and
they'd
spend.
spend it all.
Wow.
The rest weren't sure. And I think the ABC did a similar thing recently and got a similar result with a wider survey. So, and we saw that, of course, in the June quarter, people are uncertain, and when things are uncertain, particularly in New South Wales and in Victoria, the two biggest states by population. I know WA is wonderful, but it's, you know, we have bigger populations, so much more important for the big macro numbers. It relies on a lot. So a real Keynesian budget would have done something like, here's some grants to the states to help you do more for social housing. You know, land costs are a huge thing. So how can we do more than just offer cheap interest rates, given that cheap interest rates are cheap already? What about incentives to, when you're building that social housing and an existing social housing, to green them? So let's put solar on the roofs. Let's put energy efficiency measures in, give people, you know, some vouchers to spend on more energy efficient equipment in their home, so that they not only stimulate some demand, but they're actually going to lower their long-term energy bills. So a win for everyone. And I think that's what was missing from this. Even spending money on more childcare initiatives increases female participation. So you're getting long-term gains, but it's not in this government's lexicon to think like that. It's got to be this, the wording's been temporary and targeted, and that temporary is being hammered into us.
Well, in fact, and it is interesting because Hamish Douglas, who's, you know, one of the best investors in Australia from the Magellan Group, was in the paper today saying anybody who thinks that debt doesn't have to eventually be paid off believes in the tooth fairy. Now, he said, you know, so he's saying, I'm not saying, I do agree with what's happening now, but I mean, in a way, he was saying, yes, temporary is the word of the moment. This is what I think is going to, I just don't think we're going to hit it yet, but I think we're going to hit it next year. And I just think that's quite important for Vinnie's to think about myself.
Oh, we will. I mean, it's totally right. Debt does matter in the long run. At the moment, we can afford to service the debt, interest rates are low, but there comes a point at which you can't just keep building and building and building, because, you know, eventually, however low interest rates are, and they will stay low. We've heard the Reserve Bank today giving a pretty well a guarantee that rates will be tweaked even lower to the extent that's possible. If nothing's going to happen, you know, they're managing the 3-year, the 5-year interest rates. So it's not a problem now, but it will be. But it doesn't mean that you can't, spending money on some initiatives that generates excess growth. You know, we know that childcare will more than pay for itself. That will generate additional revenue. That will generate additional taxes, and it all comes back into the government. I quite understand that they don't want to bake in, to use the government's terminology, high spending initiatives forever. But where something is either, it's temporary, you know, spending money on social housing doesn't have to go on forever either, or greening of housing doesn't have to, it can be temporary, can be for 2 years, you provide those sorts of grants and initiatives. But other things that are permanent, like raising the rate, like childcare, generate additional economic returns that then generate additional revenues to government. So don't just ask, what does it cost? Ask, what does it cost to not do it? And what does it generate in return?
Well, and look, there's, in fact, there are a couple of questions that have come in. You know, the temporary raising of the job seeker rate above the poverty line was life-changing for people, and I think we have seen that quite vividly. I read today there's been something like a 30% drop in people seeking financial counselling. I thought that was amazing too, quite amazing, though they're expecting it to pick up next year. And, you know, Vinnie's has long been a prominent voice, someone else says, in calling for a permanent increase to Australia's social safety net, but they haven't succeeded. So, I mean, Jody, you know, this is what I think we're being asked to think about tonight.
Yeah.
What's the word? Yeah. Does this time offer a change of tone or language, do you think, this pandemic? That actually might subtly shift? I think it might, but I just wonder how you see it might shift the debate.
Yeah, look, I think probably a couple of things there. One is I think there was a missed opportunity around investing in social housing and being able to provide housing and housing, social and affordable housing, that is a safety net for people who are impacted, and it can do a whole range of other things around employment and things like that. But seeing it as really worthwhile infrastructure, I think is an important element, and you can link it to a whole range of other things.
So why do you think it wasn't? Because I mean, to me, that's blindingly obvious. Why wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, one thing we saw, I mean, growth of regional centres, a whole range of, maybe it's about, really, I probably don't have the answer for that, but you know, to me, it generates so much employment, and I've seen that through my own program. So, you know, I was disappointed in that. But one thing I did see that we were pleased about is IBA got some additional funding to support Aboriginal home ownership. And that's, for us, is an enormous priority as well, is that people are supported to buy their own homes.
Right.
And this was for building in regional centres, for Aboriginal people to build in regional centres.
What sort of money was given over to that?
I think it was about 150 million.
Oh, right.
You know, so I would hope in New South Wales we can take a lot of advantage of that. It's for individuals, but we would hope that there's some Aboriginal people out there who could take advantage of that in regional centres. And we have had a bit of a push on home ownership as well, because we do see that as how you can change people's life expectations and experiences.
It's quite controversial inside the in Aboriginal communities, isn't it?
It can be, but it's we've done some what we call listen and yarn sessions, and a huge proportion of people want to own their own homes, and they want to own the social housing property that they've been living in as well. So how do we support people to be outside of social housing and to move through that spectrum, I suppose, if you like, and become you know, sort of independent in that sense. But so that was one thing we did see. I mean, I think that there was an enormous opportunity missed there in both the housing and the green technology that can be attached to it. As I said, we've been doing solar on our houses and are planning to have that at 100% in several years' time. But, you know, that's around reducing energy poverty for our tenants and providing them with, you know, a sort of, I suppose it's a bit of a barrier and a buffer in terms of what else they can spend their money on. We've been doing a whole range of things like that, so people can actually live very dignified lives in a house that, you know, for our tenants, and we've heard this over and over, it's not just a house, it's a home. And how do we make sure that people feel very dignified as a social housing tenant, and actually have other options as well?
Kirsty, I just wonder how you hear this, you know, what opportunities might come for something like, you know, just given how Vinnie's represents itself. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting challenge.
I'm just reading some of the comments in the chat, actually, and I was just reading one that said, you know, given the federal government's latest budget didn't address inequality or climate change or poverty, you know, where do we see the change coming from? And I think that's, you know, that's the pivotal question for a lot of people, you know, in Australia, and a lot of people on this Zoom call tonight. You know, I mean, how can we not just, you know, make comment on it, how it is now, but make change into the future and be involved in that change? So, you know, I think, you know, for me, it's about improved decision making and making sure that that we can advocate with and for people who are affected both by the budget and by the work of Vinnie's and you know, everything else that's happening within this space. So how can we all be involved in encouraging people who are involved in decision making to keep the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalised at the centre, I think is an important thing.
I wonder whether, whether in fact, in a funny way, the opportunity is there to build an argument about the benefits of investing, having to infuse such a big amount of money for purposes, you know, sponsored by the pandemic, and that there's an argument to leverage off exactly what has been achieved, which is a different sort of quest, I think. In other words, if they have, it's sort of competence-led, if you know what I mean, to sort of show what has been the overt benefit of, obviously, so many people have just felt just this incredible sense of relief that they do feel a dignity, and they do feel they can make plans about their financial plans, if you know what I mean. That's massive, you know. rather than just hanging on for grim death. I just wonder whether it's a slightly different argument that I wonder whether, you know, Vinnie's could put. I mean, there is a question here from Peter McNamara, from President of the State Council. The Pope's recent encyclical says the parable of the Good Samaritan presents the basic decision we need to make in order to rebuild our wounded world. He says the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social and religious project. How can we encourage decision-making that prioritises people who've been excluded and who are suffering, but I would add, and who are showing that with a little bit of extra help, they become different sort of citizens? You know, to me, that's quite exciting, but I don't know whether I'm getting carried away here.
No, I mean, that is the story, right, of Vinnie's, of Caritas, of a lot of our agencies, you know, a tiny little bit of input.
Yes.
And you see this magnified, you know, impact in people's lives. You know, that's, I guess that's the message of these.
Well, that's what Jody's been telling us too.
Yeah, that's right, you know, and I think, yeah, so, you know, I think it is really important. I think that's a really good question. It's a really good question because the encyclical anyway is this like radical, you know, blueprint for what to do with the world after the pandemic. But, you know, I think for us, we've spoken today about getting marginalised and vulnerable people involved in policy making, but I think it does come down to leadership and improving decision making is something that we can all be involved in. And by all, I mean school kids, retired people, and everyone, you know, in between. You know, we have agency in Australia. We can go and meet with our MPs. We can be part of coalitions. We can advocate for what we believe in. And so I think it's a really exciting time because people are feeling energised and mobilised. And I think for Vinnie's, it's a real opportunity to use that energy and to channel it into telling this story to policymakers in Australia.
Well, I wonder, Nicki, is that notion that there's a real yield from what we might call splashing the money around, but there's a real yield that could be articulated well? Would they, you know, from what you know of your own community and people in power, would they be receptive to that?
So there is a framework for looking at, you know, what we economists call cost-benefit analysis, but which is known as the social return on investment, which is actually just what we would call a triple bottom line analysis. So it is taking that social and environmental considerations. And we actually did some work with Indigenous Business Australia, and we did look at the social and economic impacts of their Indigenous home ownership program, and this was about a year and a bit ago. And we actually surveyed 7,000 people, and we got 1,000 responses from the Indigenous community. Now this, you know, we were expected to get maybe a couple of hundred if we were lucky. This program had such a profound impact on people's lives. It wasn't just, I own something. It allowed families to do things in a way that they had never had. You know, it's not just about housing or affordable housing, it's about appropriate housing, because a lot of social housing isn't necessarily appropriate, particularly in an Indigenous context. You know, the kids benefited, the family relationships benefited, community relationships blossomed, and there is a framework in which you can use an SRO framework that allows you to put monetary values on those things. Now, when you do it in a traditional cost-benefit analysis, the very biggest impact was the economic stimulus from building houses that would not otherwise have been built, because these people would not have got loans if it hadn't been for IBA. But the myriad of different outcomes from that social well-being perspective, even though the values, the economic values associated with those are much smaller, they are still incredibly significant, and obviously for the people. And it's not just that you were delivering new houses to people, but a lot of those people had been in social housing previously, and that freed up that social housing for other people. So it was this chain reaction that went on right through to basically meaning that there were homeless people who were going to have a bed to sleep in right across that chain reaction. And we can measure these things. And I'm very proud of a lot of the work that Deloitte Access Economics does, is that we never look at the economics in isolation. We do try and capture those social impacts as well, and to make sure that we are representing the full picture, not just saying, here's the dollars and cents. Now in Gov Treasuries, unfortunately, are a little bit slower to recognise some of these benefits, but they are starting to, and they, you know, even around things about the benefits of place, you know, they're understanding as a result of this pandemic, not everyone has equal access to green spaces, but these have huge flow-on benefits to physical and mental health. And they're starting to think about, how do we actually put that into our methodology? How do we, and they are changing. It's slow. Good. Some governments are better than others, but it's happening.
Well, look, I'm just being aware of our time, and look, I just think there's plenty. It's very meaty. What an extraordinary time, you know, like what an amazing time we're living through. I do think it's really profound. The longer it goes on, the more profound I find it is, and I think it's shifting me. Certainly it's shifting me about technology dramatically, as I'm learning tonight, but it's deeper than that. And I like to think that's a little bit of a metaphor for a much wider sort of shift. So I'm going to thank very much Nicki Hutley, Jody Broun and Kirsty Robertson. Thank you very much. Lovely to have you join us. I hope that you all do thank our panellists. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the various questions, particularly the young one, but anyway. Now, there is a 30-minute event, post-event networking opportunity, by the way, which Sarah mentioned right at the start. All registered participants can go to a separate Zoom meeting, and that's a chance for you to come together to discuss what we heard tonight. Tell us where we could have, you know, fleshed it out more or didn't get to your questions with fellow Vincentians across the state. Now, I think the link was emailed out to you all, so go back quickly if you don't have it into your email account. And it was registered participants via Eventbrite. And we will also include the link in the comments box on this Zoom webinar in a moment. So if you'd like to join the further conversation via that link, you're most welcome. Thank you for welcoming me tonight. I hope Rosalie Rendu, if she was here, would approve. I think she would. Not quite what she and Frederick Ozanam actually had in mind, but it's all part of a continuum. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye for now.